Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. The Inevitable Policy Response is a climate transition forecasting consortium commissioned by the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment. It aims to prepare institutional investors for the portfolio risks and opportunities associated with accelerated policy responses to climate change. Our guests in this episode are Anthony Hobley and Jakob Thomae, who co-hosted the launch of the IPR Forecast Policy Scenario 2023 during Climate Week in New York. IPR forecasts a continued acceleration in climate policy between now and 2025 and believes that those policy responses will be increasingly forceful, abrupt, and disorderly. So, IPR produces in-depth scenarios to assist investors navigating the financial, market, and real economy uncertainties inherent in climate transition. Anthony and Jakob will join me in a moment, but first I want to say a few words about our sponsor. If you're tuning into this podcast, then you already understand the crucial role finance plays in the transition to a sustainable future. With the right individuals leading the way in top companies, sustainability becomes more than a buzzword. That's why we're excited to have Acre as our sponsor. As a world-leading sustainability search and recruitment company, Acre enables organizations to create real change by embedding and developing purpose-driven people in their teams. Visit the Acre website to learn more about their latest opportunities or to get in touch about building your perfect team. Hello, Anthony and Jakob, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. How are you today?
Good, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you so much for having us on your podcast, on the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks very much for joining us. And we're going to jump right into the questions that we have prepared for you both. And Jakob, the first question is for you. What is the inevitable policy response?
So the inevitable policy response is the idea that ultimately climate change will lead us to drive a policy response, to define the word with the word, a policy acceleration that is going to eventually deliver net zero this century. So we forecast CO2 by 2060 and greenhouse gas emissions by 2080. And that this policy response will in fact also deliver with all the uncertainties accounted for, a well below 2 degrees temperature outcome. And we believe that not because we like to have rose-colored glasses on, but because it falls from the climate reality. It simply, and I think the pandemic showed that, defies belief that policymakers would sit idly by as the planet burns. We could have imagined that before the planet started burning, perhaps because it was the abstract, but I think the last year have robbed us of that illusion, and that is the conversation the inevitable policy response wants to have.
Terrific. Well, thank you for those opening remarks. And Anthony, can we talk about the inevitable policy response? Why is a policy response to the climate crisis inevitable, and when will it happen?
I think exactly. You've hit on the core of what IPR is all about. It's based on the thesis that, we are not going to sit back and do nothing in the response to this crisis. Much as we didn't sit back and do nothing and just accept the COVID pandemic, much as we haven't sat back and accepted things like polio, and all kinds of other examples we can give. And as I think the impacts stack up and people really begin to feel that, certainly as they've done in the last couple of years, this year, I think we are seeing that response. We are seeing the sort of political tectonic plates move. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is a really good example. Even if you didn't look at the energy transition, we've just seen the IEA's latest, very actually aggressive, it's called Real Waves, their latest 1.5 degree pathway, which is very bullish, particularly on the energy transition. Well, if we've got to this point with wind and solar because of a policy response, Nordic countries in the sort of 70s and 80s, European countries in the 90s, the energy vendor in Germany, followed by Spain, France, the UK. And then the response to the financial crisis, the Obama package, significant amount of that went into renewables, and then China picking it up and scaling it. So we are where we are because of a policy response that is gathering pace. So as the evidence stacks up, as the impacts of climate stack up, that inevitability becomes, again, following Jakob's lead, defining with the world, more inevitable. And I do think we are seeing that. And clearly, I think with many of the IEA report, the IPR forecast, destination now is, I think, beyond doubt. What is still up for debate is speed and scale, the speed at which we get there. And I think built into the inevitable policy response, because that of inevitability, is the later it happens, the more aggressive it will be, because the evidence, the need to respond will be greater, and the more disruptive that will be. The earlier it is, the less disruptive. And I think that's critical for investors to understand and to be aligned with this. I think also, and we can get into this in the conversation, it's important to understand the difference between a forecast, a scenario, and a pathway. Most of what is out there are scenarios and pathways of what we would like it to be, what it should be, not what it is.
Okay, good. So, Jakob, I'm going to ask you to pick up where Anthony has left off, and that's with the fact that IPR provides a quarterly policy forecast as opposed to a scenario or a pathway. Why is that so important, and why is it unique?
Well, it's unclear why it's unique, because it is kind of surprising that we don't have more of this kind of conversation, I think, right? I mean, this is the quintessential question that investors are facing. What will the transition look like? And the response to that question so far from the scenario modeling community is, well, sort of a potpourri of options and scenarios. It could go this way, it could go the other way. Well, what do you think? Oh, I don't have any skin in the game. Well, we think it's ideally 1.5. So there's a scenario. Yeah, but do you think 1.5 will happen? Probably not. So what do you think will happen? Well, maybe it's this one, right? So this is the kind of debate we want to move beyond, right? By IPR saying this is a high conviction forecast, what that means is we think this will happen. And it does make the debate complicated, because when we launch, we have one set of investors who are saying, so why are you so much more optimistic than, say, the global stock take or the NDC scenario modeling work that's seeing things run on 2.6 degree trajectory? And obviously the response to that is, well, we're not more optimistic than them, because they don't have it's not what they believe. They're just showing what happens if literally from now until the end of this century, we don't accelerate or add any more climate policies to what we have in place, which is, pardon the word, an absurd proposition, right? I mean, we're used to policy backsliding on some level, but the idea that we would never build on any of the policy infrastructure we've put in place over the next 80 years is just absurd. And so I think that's why we aren't actually more optimistic than them, because these other providers don't have conviction behind what they are saying. I mean, personally, they do, of course, the individuals, but sort of the public material is conviction free. And that's, I think, important for investors to understand. When we survey investors, when we survey climate policy experts, they largely agree with our forecast. We are a realistic and most likely future that investors can prepare for, and that, perhaps even more importantly, investors can invest in. And that is, I think, the key distinction between a here, there, gone tomorrow mentality to scenarios that are just there to illustrate a world, rather than what we're trying to do, which is, and we may be wrong, and we will definitely be wrong on one or the other point, what we're trying to do is start the conversation about what we all actually collectively and individually, and of course the people who are allocating the capital, believe about the transition.
Yeah, so Jakob, thanks. You're suggesting that your latest IPR forecast is implying temperatures that will peak at 1.7 to 1.8 degrees centigrade. And this suggests that we're on track for the first part of the Paris Agreement target, namely keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees centigrade. This is pretty optimistic, isn't it? And I'll ask both of you to address this one. Anthony, why don't you go first?
Well,
I'll let Jakob get into the details of this and the analysis. But yes, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. The Paris target is, in a sense, in two parts. And so what we're talking about here is optimism around the first part, but still a degree of pessimism around the second part. So it is not, we are not suggesting in any way to put off the pedal. In fact, quite the opposite. In fact, there's a good reason to put more, I'm trying to think of, I'm thinking of an electric car rather than sort of gas when we put the foot on the pedal. Ramp
Yes.
rather than gas. I think this is critical because, if we are still nowhere near on track, and we're hearing from AR6, and we've got the global stock take, and even the IEA report, as aggressive as it is still talking about 2+ degrees. I think somewhere near 2.4. That's pretty depressing. If you think about all the advocacy, the money, we're soon going to have the 28th set of climate negotiations, all the climate, action summits that we've had around the world, and we're still way above 2. And let's be clear, I think as we understand, my understanding, I'm not a climate scientist, but my understanding is we have a much better understanding of the sensitivities of our society and economy to a changing climate. So if I could paraphrase, 2 degrees is the new 4. So we do not want to be going above 2 degrees because I think we're into catastrophic territory. And 1.5, I think we're beginning to understand, it's there for a reason because, that's where we think we have a high probability, and it's still not 100%, that, at least there's a degree of stability, that we can maybe live with. It's still bad. And so let's be clear, 1.5 is still bad, and ideally we'd want to be even lower than that. But above 2 is catastrophic. And I think there's a real risk, and I've seen this in recent meetings, that psychologically we can't cope with that. And there's a throwing up our hands and going, well, what's the point? Whereas, if we're not on track, we're going to overshoot 1.5, but if it's 1.7 to 1.8, at least we're within, and I'm trying to use a nice phrase, but a spitting distance of 1.5. You can still imagine, really getting to grips with this. And even if we overshoot, pulling back. It's not ideal. We don't want to be there. We'd rather be at 1.5, but I think it's critical to understand that. So what we're saying is, yes, we're on track to meet the first part, which is well below 2, but we're not on track for the second bit, which is, 1.5 or as close to that as we can be. And so, but I actually think this sends a really positive message. Look, we're not far off. So why wouldn't we put even more effort in? Because the destination is clear. Why sort of, sit back and not do more and live with all the disruption that 1.7 to 1.8 would imply? Actually, I think this should encourage us to go even further because we're beginning to see progress. I mean, I'll let Jakob talk a little bit more about why.
Yeah.
Why we're in the steering.
Jakob, before you start,
go ahead, sorry.
I'm sorry. You've both used the term stock take, which I believe many of our listeners and followers are not familiar with. I know I wasn't familiar with it until recently. So if you can incorporate what that means into your response, I'd appreciate it.
So the global stock take is this concept under the Paris Agreement that we regularly check in basically with all the country commitments, see how ambitious they are, and see where they end up, where we end up with those commitments relative to the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And remember, the Paris Agreement is bottom up, so each country sort of builds their own sort of commitments into this process, and this is sort of a centralized way to sort of give everyone a grade effectively. And in fact, what's I think interesting and what we're seeing is that these are part of the ratchet process. So we're expecting those commitments to accelerate. And we're obviously seeing in part bottom-up policies more ambitious than the high-level global commitments. So I think we are almost in a place where these nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which is what these individual pledges are called, are lagging the underlying policy dynamics in some of these countries. And of course, that's a mixed picture, but it's I think interesting. Now, I mean, to your question about optimism, pessimism, I just turn it around. Why is everyone so pessimistic? All right. So to just illustrate the point, under 2 degrees, according to most scenarios, still allows us to get to net zero by the 2090s or even 2100. we have a lot of runway left to get to under 2 degrees. That's 500 megatons of year-on-year reduction that we're talking about on the CO2 side. A 2.5 degree scenario in turn, or, there's some uncertainty, let's live with it. But the mid 2 degree scenario, let's call it that basically means emissions at current level for another 60 to 80 years. Zero global annual emissions reduction for another 60 to 80 years under the sort of 2.6, 2.7, 2.5, 2.8, that kind of ballpark scenario. So 50, 60, 70, 80, you can kind of work out sort of the range here. This kind of pessimism seems implausible. We are already seeing policy ambition on electric vehicles, renewable energy bending the curve. The IEA STEP scenario, which is still being updated this year, is already suggesting we're going to take 5 gigatons of CO2 out of the system by 2030 relative to the 40 where we are right now. So there can be backsliding. There can be other macro factors that are going to throw a wrench in the engine, right? Of course. And we may not get all the way to 1.7, 1.8. But the idea that we are on track for 2.5 is a type of pessimism about the climate policy ambition, which is not just inconsistent with what we think the acceleration will look like, because it would be plausible to assume acceleration. It's frankly also kind of inconsistent with what we're seeing right now, whether you're looking at policy or whether you're looking at the underlying technology trends. And I think that's what we have to reconcile. And by the way, when we look at the surveys, like I said, climate policy experts actually agree with our quote unquote optimism. So that's the realism. Anthony highlighted the optimism of, keeping 1.5 in play. The pessimism is everything that's south of where we are, I would say. And I think that's where the debate needs to be reframed. It's just people don't appreciate it. And this is because we've talked about 6 degrees in the past. For those that have been around this topic a little bit longer, that was something that was part of the discourse at some point in our lives. That every 0.1 degree of warming is just a lot of emissions. So once we bend the curve, we have all the opportunity in the world to bend it to where we need to be to under well below. And, speaking to Anthony's point, eventually hopefully get back to 1.5.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for expanding on those concepts there. Anthony, back to you for this one. While the IPR forecast has been well received by the investment community, there's been some criticism from NGOs in the space, hasn't there, over the last couple of years? Well, for many years. But what do you say to them in response to their criticisms?
Well, building on, I think, Jakob's point, I think we have learned that a diet of negative headlines, a diet of just trying to sort of get people scared into taking action doesn't work. Neither, actually, on its own, does the story of the great green future, green jobs, green investment, etc. Where I have some sympathy with NGOs is you have to give people a reason to get, to leave their comfort zone, to get off the sofa, and get into that sort of diet or go to the gym and exercise and get fit. But if you simply scare someone with you're unhealthy, you're going to have a serious disease, then I think a lot of people psychologically, reach for their psychological comfort blanket. And you have to find a way of combining the two. So you have to combine, fear and hope. And I actually, what I would say to the NGOs is I think IPR is a perfect example of combining those two things. As I said earlier, 1.8, 1.7 to 1.8 is not good. We know anything above 1.5 and possibly 1.5, is not safe. But if people, particularly investors, one of the primary audiences for the IPR, look at this and go, well, nothing's happening despite all of the effort, all of the noise and communications and negotiations around climate. So actually we can keep investing in these other things because we're not going to pay in the short term any kind of financial price. Whereas you look at IPR as forecast, And I think investors, those managing portfolios and assets, have to look at that very seriously and go, oh, actually, our investments are out of line with where things are going. And I think that's critical. And it will build up a momentum. But it doesn't tell you that everything's rosy and we're on track. It tells you that, we are off track because we're overshooting 1.5, but we're still within shooting distance, if you like. I was at an event of many climate policy and NGO leaders in Scotland at Findhorn Eco Village over the summer. And they did this really interesting exercise, the 1.5 continuum. And these are all people working in the climate space. And the exercise was, if you believe 1.5 is possible, stand at the left side of the room. If you believe it is not possible, stand at the right side of the room. I was shocked that probably nearly 70% of people there when stood at the right side of the room, 1.5 is not. And I remember one lady, I hope she doesn't mind me quoting her, I'll quote her anonymously, said that that's where she lives, because that's what she believes now, but every day she commutes to 1.5 as possible for her job. And there was a real sense, I think, of despair and people really grappling with this. And we're beginning to see, I think, there was something, and I've seen a number of things posted recently that, we've got to wake up to the fact and accept 1.5 is not possible. And I think that's coming from a lot of this pessimism that we're on track well over 2 degrees. And actually, I think that is far more dangerous to what we are trying to achieve, and lets people like the UK's Prime Minister off the hook by trying to soften some of the targets. But if the message was, no, we're on track, countries are investing, which they are, this technology as a result of policy is starting to really scale up. And actually, if you soften your targets, all you are doing is disadvantaging yourself economically, which I believe is what has happened with the UK after such a strong leadership position for so many years. And that's why I think, the NGOs should look and really understand IPR much more, that actually it's incredibly helpful to their cause.
Okay. So, Jakob, back to you for this next question, and that is that the focus of the IPR's policy reports, the intended audience is actually the finance community, particularly asset owners, and managers. Why is this so important? Or why is it so important for them? And what should they be doing in light of IPR forecasts?
Well, I think it speaks to an issue we've sort of touched upon a little bit earlier, which is ultimately you put your money where you believe. I mean, that's the sort of the core constraint to any capital allocation decisions. Now, you can sometimes be weird off course and maybe your beliefs are not static. I hope they're not, obviously, in many cases. And sure, there are regulatory constraints. This is a messy world, but at its heart, you put the money where you think the world is going, where your city is going, whatever universe that is relevant to you, to your investment decision. And so the challenge is to figure out where the world is going under this climate transition. And now, obviously, the one way to do that is what we've done so far is to tell everyone to sort of speak into existence a 1.5 degree world. And we see that's not really working because, despite some prejudices among some of us, investors are generally smart people and understand when a spade's a spade. What IPR is trying to do is really be honest about where we think the world's going. And sometimes that involves, like I said, hard choices. We think, for example, Turkey and South Africa are not going to meet their net zero goal. It's not going to be a great message for allocating more ambitious capital into those countries, but it speaks to the integrity of our process. And that integrity is so processed because it builds conviction. And that conviction is the prerequisite for capital allocation to the transition. And I think the noise around all the different scenarios has sort of created this anything goes, nobody knows mindset among some investors. And that's not a criticism. It's just, it's all uncertain. We don't know what's happening in the future and it's a mess and everyone's got a different opinion. We only know that we need to get to 1.5, but we also equally know that basically it's almost impossible, or some would say impossible. where in practice, the corridor of futures is narrowed dramatically. We actually have a pretty narrow corridor now of policy outcomes. There's 5 to 10 year deltas with the odd black swan policy event in some election here or there, sure. But the overall policy universe, so the 300 plus policies that we're forecasting, I think that universe has narrowed dramatically, at least in the sort of central futures. And with that understanding, your capital allocation decisions can come with the conviction that I think is necessary for them to materialize, and also is really ultimately fundamentally necessary for them to have the impact that I think, many of us are hoping is sustainable finance mindset or industry or whatever you want to call this beehive has. And I think, one of the interesting questions, one of the large bond investors in the room at one of the launch events said, all right, well, where do you put sort of the probability of, undershooting, overshooting your forecast? Goes back to the pessimism, optimism question. And you could say, all right, well, we're assuming forecasts, the policies are still accelerate. So maybe we are assuming, the risk is more on one side. But of course, really fundamentally from a strategic and risk perspective, the entire risk is on more accelerated policy than what we're forecasting, or 90%, let's say. Because if the net zero year is 2060 or 2065, the core underlying transformation is similar. Sure, you may be 5 years slower, 5 years faster. You maybe don't make as much money as you would along the way by leaving, high carbon a little too early, or getting into the green business a little too early as well. But from a fundamental risk perspective, that narrow corridor means actually your risk profile is reducing dramatically. And the biggest residual risk downside is really on us being wrong about being not, quote unquote, optimistic enough. That's why we talk to investors, and whether it's NGOs, whether it's policymakers, and whether it's consumers at the end of the day, or us as citizens, we need to start to establish what the conviction about the transition is in order to have that change that we want to see in the world. And like I said, sometimes that will make us look as the conservatives because we're not predicting 1.5, but ultimately will help us have the kind of conversation. And that's in our fundamental belief that the policy response is inevitable. So we feel confident that over time, we are always on the side of a forecast that speaks to that inevitable policy response.
Okay. And Anthony, back to you for our last question, and that is, beyond the world of finance, where is the IPR forecasting process most widely relevant? Does it apply to governments and policymakers, as well as other businesses and even to NGOs?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it has much wider applicability. I mean, even if you just think of, investors needing a forecast, as Jakob has said, so they understand, where we're most likely going, as opposed to all these pathways and scenarios which suggest where we should go, which are not really going to inform investment decisions. But a forecast, and don't forget, we are moving from a backward-looking world to a forward-looking world, which is actually why a forecast is so critically important. We're trying to drive a transition racing against a climate clock that is unprecedented. So all the sort of backward-looking tools we used to use in the past don't really help us anymore. And so that's probably why, to Jakob's earlier point, it's taken a while for people to understand we need this forward-looking forecast because of that change, which is, we're not wired for yet. We will be, because we'll have to be over the next 30 years. But if it's critical for investors to understand where their portfolio, how to align their portfolios or what is most likely to happen, it's also just as important for companies trying to understand how their business model and products are going to change. And, they're being required to develop, net zero strategies and pathways. For governments, understanding, well, okay, what's our policy framework need to be to make us competitive? I think that's now a live issue for most governments with the sort of policy that's being introduced. And this, in a sense, helps them understand across 20 plus countries of the major economies in the world covering most of emissions and GDP, where we are collectively going and where individual countries are going. So actually they and I think that then also helps them with their electorates, with their people, to say, well, actually, we need to do this because it's important for keeping us competitive, for the industries of the future, for the jobs that you will all need, in the future. So all the things I think people care about, and also for how we ensure, we provide cost-effective energy and resources all of that will be to some degree dependent on the pathway, the world as a whole is going, the policy pathway. And this is what the IPR forecast provides. So I actually think it, is critically important. One of the things that I think we're beginning to see is a renewed belief after many decades in industrial strategy. Well, again, as you design that industrial strategy, as a government, as a policymaker, as you align the policies in your city, you don't do that in a vacuum. You do that by understanding, well, how is everybody else changing? What policies are being used elsewhere? Where is everybody else? So I actually think it's critically important. And I think it is actually, when you look at it in that context, it is surprising that IPR, is the first to have developed such a forecast. I think we will see, as people understand that and how critically important that is, and to have that benchmark, I think we will see, more reliance on IPR's forecast, and we'll see the development of more tools like this. I think this is just the beginning.
Terrific. Jakob, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think the story has been laid out wonderfully by Anthony, and indeed, I think what's sort of interesting about this as well is the last point that Anthony spoke to, right, which is part of what we're trying to do is also get people to take a view. If somebody comes back to IPR and says, well, I think that we're going to see, I don't know, deforestation in Indonesia, we think it'll effectively end by 2030. And they say, well, I think you're way too optimistic. It'll be 2035. All right, great. Let's have that conversation. That's the sort of the arena of ideas that we're trying to perhaps engineer as making it sound too aggressive, but at least to try to sort of help create or stimulate. And I think that's where we see the conversation is going. Look, you don't have to agree with us. And forecasts are a scary proposition because inevitably, just as the policy response is inevitable, so too will it be inevitable that we'll be wrong on one or the other account. And so, we're kind of putting our sort of our head out there to get sort of beaten up about one or the other aspect. But if you don't believe us, tell us what you believe, and let's have that conversation. And I think for IPR, it's about being a forecasting platform that allows us to have intelligent conversations. And I'm convinced, anybody listening to this podcast now who thinks, all right, I understand what you guys are saying, but still way too optimistic. Well, I think they'll realize that once they go into this process, they're more optimistic than they think. Because even a 5 or 10 year delay to some of our forecasts still has a negligible impact on temperatures or on the overall net zero goals. It has almost by design, a 5 to 10 year impact. And that is, I think, such an educational process because we're not sitting there going, we want the world to be 1.8. We've literally looked at 300 individual policies and said, what do we think this will be? We survey experts. We look at the current policy in place. We look at the market trends. We have a decision meeting on the policy. We make a call. Next, across the 100 policies. And then we tell the modeling team, tell us what the temperature and net zero outcomes will be. That process is a really productive one I can recommend to any investor, and one that allows you to engage with not just what you want the world to look like ultimately, but what you think it will look like at the end of the day.
I think there's a couple of generations of investors on the way up and into key positions in companies and corporations and policy-making organizations around the world that want to believe that the future creates opportunity for them, and it's not just going to be a dismal all the way down process in terms of climate risk. So Anthony and Jakob, where online can our listeners learn more about your work with IPR, and how can followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast contact you with questions about the topics that we've discussed in today's episode?
So you can find us at IPR, the letters IPR.transitionmonitor.com. For some weird reason that we're working to figure out, it's not www. I think this is just a modern way to live in this world. I'm so the World Wide Web kind of guy. So it's IPR.transitionmonitor.com. Find all our research there and email us at Jakob, Jakob at theafinance.org. That's Thea, THEIA finance.org. And obviously Google us, find us on LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts is, I think, the typical line. And so wherever you get your news, that's hopefully where we'll be. And obviously we're supported by PRI here in this work. We should have probably said that more prominently up top. So PRI has commissioned the work you mentioned at the beginning. You can obviously find us around PRI, and I think this podcast will come out afterwards, but perhaps you'll find us at Tokyo as well at PRI in person. And if you have, then you'll be looking forward to listening to this, as I'll advertise it there extensively.
Okay. Anthony, how about you? How can folks get in touch with you? And Jakob, if you send us links to these other locations online where people can reach you, we'll be glad to add them to the notes for the program.
Yeah, well, I mean, LinkedIn is always a good one. And actually, there's a great inevitable policy response page where, all the latest forecast news and so on get shared. So follow inevitable policy response on LinkedIn as well. I have a couple of contacts, so please reach out through LinkedIn, connect with me there, follow me there. I've just started a new role as well, looking at how we de-risk the transition and capital flows into adaptation resilience, where I mean, this type of forecast is going to be critical for the insurance sector. I think, 1.8 also shows you that, it's insurable. There will be a lot of risk and uncertainty, but, I worry that a world above 2 degrees, will be less insurable. But you can contact me if you're interested in that context on anthony.hobley@howdengroup.com, personally on ahobley24@gmail.com.
Great. And we'll include those links to your access points, Anthony, as well in our notes for the program. Well, thanks again to Anthony Hobley and Jakob Thomae of IPR. And for our listeners, if you're ready to take your team to the next level, or you're an experienced sustainability professional, visit the ACRE website to get in touch. With the right individuals leading the way in your company, sustainability becomes more than a buzzword. Let ACRE enable real change by embedding and developing purpose-driven people in your teams. And to our followers, join us again next week for another episode. I'm Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.